Alright, sorry about me throwing up in the corner, but I can't configure this thing where I can switch it in between, so I'm going to be up here. What's one of the most mysterious places on Earth that has natural phenomena that has just baffled scientists for hundreds of years and people? The Bermuda Triangle. So, behind the Bermuda Triangle, it's really just a region of area in the Atlantic Ocean. And there's nothing super special about it except for all these phenomena that happen here, and they're just odd, weird stories that are kind of eerie. So I'm going to take you back through the origins of the phenomenon, where it all started, some stories and events that happened, and then why we think it happens and how it happens today. So first, we got the actual geography of the Bermuda Triangle. So it goes from Key West, Florida, right around Miami, that area, down to Puerto Rico and up to Bermuda Island, which is west and a little bit south. It's west of the U.S. and not quite within the boundaries if you're going directly south. So a little bit west, direct south boundary of the edge of the U.S. And it has a trench on one side along the western side, which is really deep right there for that most part, and then shallows out as it gets closer to the Bermuda. And this area is common with severe storms, some shallow weather, and the trench in between. And so the first story, or the first, event of this, or legit finding of the Bermuda, was supposedly in Shakespeare's play The Tempest. He has a shipwreck in that play, and it's supposedly could have been a British colonial that was obviously searching the Atlantic Sea for land and shipwrecked into Bermuda, the island. And they crashed into the island, which is supposed to be pictured right there from Shakespeare's play. And once they crashed on the island, they lived on the island and inhabited the place afterwards. And so that's like really the first story, but it's not guaranteed, it's not actual fact. One of the more solid actual occurrences of this is Christopher Columbus did pass through the Bermuda area, and when he passed through this area, he said that he thought he saw just a giant flash of fire just appear right in the ocean, just right in front of him. And then just a huge thing of light just lit up the sky a couple of days later. So I thought it was just really bizarre phenomenon that happened there. And these where it starts to get a little eerier. So later on, this is 1818, so this is about 200 to 100 years later, 200 after Shakespeare and like 100 and a half or so after Columbus. There was a ship trailing from Liverpool to New York, and they came upon a abandoned ship right here in the region of the Atlantic, the Bermuda, and they sent a crew member on the ship. He goes on the ship and finds out there's nobody on there, obviously, it's abandoned, and then a heavy storm hits them, and the ships get separated for a couple hours. They find the ship again after a couple hours, crew member's gone, everything's still on board, the ship's still fine. So they send a couple more crew members on board, alright? They're going to scavenge all the equipment and gear and everything. So they go on board, and as soon as they start looking for things, a heavy, thick fog starts rolling in as pictured there. And the ship gets lost in the fog, and then once the fog clears, they never find the ship again. So that was kind of eerie. And then dating later, about 100 years later, in 1918, there is a U.S. Navy ship, that bottom one pictured there, and that's a fuel ship, and that was en route to the Caribbeans, where it had 58 passengers, and it was the largest and fastest Navy fuel ship at the time, and just disappeared and vanished without a trace. And they didn't have all the technology and equipment as we have nowadays, so that wasn't super eerie back in the 1900s, and so that wasn't too crazy. And then, but where it starts to get a little bit weirder is the USS Procure, I'm butchering the heck out of that name, was a U.S. Navy ship that was going down to Caribbeans as well, and had 38 members, distress equipment, communications, emergency equipment, lifeboats, all that, and they can distress equipment, call for help. None of that was used. The ship was never found. They never found any of the equipment, none of the crew. Nothing was ever traced again, which is just odd. Like, why would they not call for distress, or why couldn't they, A month later, its sister ship, this Trossier, I'm butchering that one even worse probably, is sunk exactly the same scenario a month later, but had about 15 more members on it. So a ship that I did not photo there was a 510-foot cargo ship that was on its way to Europe when it disappeared in the mid-50s, which is odd because that's when the distress signaling got a lot better. We had better emergency equipment, better life rafts, communications, and still there was nothing. They had no distress, never called for an emergency, never called for contact, never found any trace of the ship or the crew members. Okay, and then going back a few years, 1945 is when the aviation first started happening in the Bermuda, and this is when things started to get weird here for aviation. Obviously, there was a crew of U.S. military members who were doing a training program, a 3-hour little training ride down in the Atlantic around the Bermuda, and on the way back, their captain said that they were headed north, and he was like, okay, I got to correct this. The compass started pointing north in another direction, so they started going the other direction. And what they believe is that they ended up heading directly into the Atlantic Ocean until, well, all of them just ran out of fuel and had to crash. And so that was the disappearance of Flight 19, and those are the 36 members. And they never found any trace of any of these guys or their planes. So what is the cause of the Bermuda? Theorists obviously say things like aliens. They think aliens are affecting us from outer space somehow. Or even Atlantis trying to affect the waters above them and the people trying to disrupt them or find them. But a little bit more realistically, we have, first of all, really severe storms that change rapidly in that area. We have the shallow waters along the west coast, and then also shallow along the Bermuda Island. And then there's the trench that they believe releases methane gas, which they believe could somehow affect what people see. For instance, if a spark were to hit this giant methane gas bubble that's coming up, it would cause like a burst of flame in the ocean, which would look really odd, obviously. So they speculated that these could be the theories, but within the last year, they found that the magnetic field in this specific region is actually so weak that the radiation gets closer to that part of the Earth than anywhere else. So right above the Bermuda, the magnetic field is so weak that the radiation can penetrate down closer to Earth than anywhere else. And they call this area SAA or SA. And what's odd about this area is even NASA can't do anything in space in this area. So their Hubble telescope passes this area 10 times a day, alright? So say it's right above the Bermuda, and they pass it 10 times a day. It spends 15% of its life there, the Hubble. And every time it passes it, they have to turn it off or it goes blank. Because when it passes this area, the radiation will affect electronics to the point where it'll start arcing, just frying electronics, and they're completely unusable and non-responsive. You can't communicate to them and back. So they get no footage through this area. So this little area that 50% of the Hubble is at, they get no footage, they get nothing, no communication, nothing back. And other countries have experienced this with their satellites as well. Like Japan, for instance, has had a satellite crash there in 2016 because it did a miscalculation and they couldn't communicate to it because it happened to be in that certain region of the magnetic field where the radiation was able to hit it. So they believe that that is what disrupts the magnetic field, what disrupts the communications and distress signals and everything like that, as well as the magnetic field affecting compasses. So it's kind of a combination between radiation and magnetic, but they believe that is what is the cause of this. So, that's the origin of it started with possibly Shakespeare, and then went to Columbus. Lots of people have disappeared. There are hundreds of people have passed from this, and still a phenomenon. The U.S. hasn't declared it an actual place or an actual threat, but it has taken the lives of hundreds and is still, for the most part, unknown for what happens there.